Good afternoon. Welcome to the EFG webinar, Mind Measure, IRMA Self-Assessment and Audit Preparation Tool. My name is Vitor Correia, and I am the Secretary General of the International Raw Materials Observatory. I'm also a past president of the European Federation of Geologists, and I will be the host of this webinar. The EFG is periodically organizing webinars to foster professional development of our fellow geologists and to increase the public awareness of the importance of geosciences. And I believe this is a perfect topic for that. I'm happy to present the speakers of today's webinar. We'll be having 4 speakers, all coming from IRMA. And the first one will be Kristy Bruckner. Kristy is an attorney with 20 years of experience working on complex law and policy issues with governments, communities, companies, and multi-stakeholders initiatives. She assists with IRMA's public engagement, partnerships, communication, and ongoing work to improve standards and audits. Kirsty's experience includes over a decade of leadership at Sustainable Development Strategies Group, working to align management of renewable energy and natural resources with sustainable development objectives. Thank you, Kristy, for joining us. We'll also be having Pamela Lesser. She is the regional lead in Europe at IRMA and a social scientist and a urban planner with over 25 years of experience working in a range of geographic locations and across sectors. And that includes government, consulting, think tanks, NGOs, and academia. Pamela brings a recent experience working on raw materials related to Horizon project and Arctic issues at University of Lapland to the IRMA extensive knowledge of mining in the European context. Her ties to the European Commission and to the European research community are strong, and for IRMA, she continues to build synergies with policymakers and other stakeholders with an interest in the extractive sector and in responsible mining. Aquinar is the sector led from mining at IRMA. She's joining us from South Africa, and she brings just under a decade of diverse experience and an unwavering commitment to responsible mining practices. Her journey in the mining sector first began as a geologist with technical proficiency in geometallurgy, in exploration and production, in companies ranging from Kimba, Iron Ore Corporate to Anglo Platinum, and to locations in South Africa and in Australia. Prior to joining IRMA, Aquinar held the position of Sustainable Business Opportunities Specialist and managed initiatives like for the International Finance Corporation and Responsible Mining Assurance at Anglo American, where she spearheaded transformation change, training, and implementation efforts across operations. Finally, last but not the least, Alan Septoff is the Information Systems Director at IRMA. And prior to joining IRMA, Alan worked for 25 years with communities to protect the environment from the adverse, or I'll say the negative impacts of resource extraction. He did this at Earthworks as Policy Director, Research Director, and Communications Director, among other roles. In those roles, Alan lobbied the US House of Senate and testified before Congress and authored analyses regarding various aspects of mining policy reform. So thank you to those speakers. To the audience, I will say that during the presentation, you can propose questions using the question and answers function in Zoom. We will select and answer some of these questions after the presentations, roughly in 50 minutes. Please, Pamela, Kristy, Aquinar, and Alan, you can start when you are ready. And again, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Vitor. We're so pleased to be spending this hour with you as the start of an engagement, which we hope will continue long beyond this webinar. I will be giving you a very brief overview of who IRMA is before turning the floor over to our resident geologist, Aquinar. So on the next slide, it provides a brief overview of where we're going in this presentation. I will cover what IRMA is. Aquinar will talk about independent third-party audits and what that process looks like. And we'll spend most of our time on a tool that is free for your use and readily available to you, the Mind Measure self-assessment tool. We welcome your questions now, and we'll answer them through the presentation and in the discussion session. So in the next slide, it gives an overview of what IRMA is. And in the next slide, you can see the foundations of IRMA are that were based on the standard for responsible mining. We currently have a draft standard for responsible mining and mineral processing, bringing processors in, and welcome your review. The standard covers a wide range of topics. It's very comprehensive and really serves as a roadmap for exploration, development, mineral processing as well. And we make an impact through IRMA's third-party independent assurance system that we'll explain on this webinar. In the next slide, you'll see the real fundamentals of who we are. We at IRMA, our standard covers industrial scale mine sites of all sizes globally. So mines anywhere can participate, and companies really value having a common standard to apply wherever they operate around the world to all types of mine materials. We have a few exceptions of coverage of materials in IRMA. That includes uranium, thermal coal, oil sands, and gas due to the unique nature of these materials, as well as we don't cover deep seabed mining projects. Assessment is at the mine site level, recognizing that mine sites across the company can range widely in impacts, benefits, performance, and we recognize that and bring assessments and transparency at the site level. And we are assessing sites at where they're at in any moment in time when they undergo an audit against the range of best practices in the IRMA standard. In the next slide, you'll see one of the very unique aspects of IRMA, which is our equal multi-stakeholder governance, giving each of the 6 sectors you see on this slide represented, each sector by 2 board members, an equal voice in IRMA governance and decision making. This is really the core of who we are at IRMA and how we ensure that we are accountable to each of these sectors equally, and that each has an equal voice in how we operate. In the next slide, you'll see an example of some of the topics covered in the IRMA standard for responsible mining. We find it important to take a holistic lens of the mining sector and not just cherry pick topics. It's important that we address reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but we can't do that without looking also at labor rights, at Indigenous rights, and the right to free, prior, informed consent, and the range of topics you see that are addressed in the IRMA standard. In the next slide, you'll see also that our standard incorporates a wide range of international frameworks. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to be aligned with standards where they are already in place and help entities that are engaged in IRMA to not have to duplicate efforts, but to make sure our process is complementary to the examples of frameworks you see here. In the next slide are some notes on our assurance process, but it's so important, again, for our accountability to all sectors that where audits take place through independent third parties, that local affected communities, rights holders, and workers are engaged in that assurance process, helping us to understand the impacts on their lives, the benefits to them of this mine, and have transparency from that lens that is included in the IRMA audit reports. In the next slide, you see examples of the 4 achievement levels. So any entity can undergo self-assessment using the Mind Measure tool, but cannot make public claims related to self-assessment. So only by using the independent third-party audit system can claims result from using the IRMA standard and system. And those are listed here, from IRMA Transparency to IRMA 50, IRMA 75, and IRMA 100. And we are excited for the day when we see a first mine to achieve IRMA 100, but we are meeting mines where they're at in this process of transparency and continuous improvement. In the next slide, you can see examples of the wide range of coverage in the IRMA system. We are scaling rapidly. Currently, we have 100 sites engaged in the IRMA system across 29 countries and 52 types of materials. And on the next slide, you can see this mapped out, our independent audits covering 10 countries, 11 companies, a wide set of materials. And in the next slide, you can see our geographic coverage, including where there are gaps. We are, through support of a regional lead in Africa, and we're so fortunate also that Aquinar is based in South Africa. We're expanding our reach in Africa, and we're actively reaching out in Asia as well, including engagements with Indonesia, and looking for ways to partner and bring Chinese sites into the IRMA system. In the next slide, you can see an example of how IRMA is reflected in government policies and platforms, and the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metals, and Sustainable Development is an example of this, referencing IRMA and this guidance on environmental and social impact assessment for its 81 member countries. In the next slide, you can see that authorities are asking for IRMA, from the US White House to the European Parliament to 170 NGOs, calling on the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and Paris Agreement COP to really address these issues of harm in mineral supply chains by calling for independent third-party verification of compliance with high-level standards like IRMA. In the next slide, you can see our system is expanding from coverage of the mine site to, important for geologists, exploration and development, mineral processing, and a new draft chain of custody standard available for your review that tracks material from the mine site to end users. In the next slide, I will turn the floor over to Aquinar.
Thank you very much, Kristy. So now that we understand what IRMA is, I will walk you through the third-party audit process. So the actual process, as you can see on the slide, actually begins with a self-assessment, followed by a stage 1 desktop audit, and then the on-site audit, followed by the verification decision, and then the whole cycle repeats itself again. So completing the pre-audit self-assessment could take anything between a few weeks to actually several months. This is dependent on the number of relevant chapters for your particular site or operation. and of course the availability of the critical mindsite staff that will be appointed to work on IRMA, and how they actually upload the necessary information that's required. So the audit planning, the next stage, the audit planning and completion of stage 1 and 2 could take as little as 3 to 4 months. Once again, this timeline can actually be augmented based on whether the operation chooses or opts to actually close their gaps. This is very optional. Or if, for example, they incorrectly completed their self-assessment, that could actually add more time onto the timeline that the operation would have set for themselves. And then after stage 2, which is the on-site audit, it could take about 3 months to finalize the draft audit report, which will be released to the operation for comments and obviously just to be reviewed. And then when this entire process is actually complete, a decision is actually taken place. And then the release of the public report takes place. Once again, this can also be deferred up to 12 months if an operation decides once again to take up the corrective action plan period. This is usually done when sites decide that they would want to get a chance to actually achieve a higher performance level. As Kristy showed you, there are different levels that you can achieve. So for example, if a site scores an IRMA 50 and they feel that they can actually close some gaps to achieve an IRMA 75, then they do take up this implementation corrective period. And then the last step on this slide is that the surveillance can then take place between 12 to 18 months after that verification decision has been taken. And then recertification again takes place within 36 months or 3 years after that verification decision takes place. And once again, the cycle continues. So on the next slide, the desktop review. So the first stage, as I said, is the desktop review, but really this section or this stage of the process is meant to just assess how ready a site is for the actual stage 2 on-site audit. It does allow the site to actually identify any of the gaps or risks, which could also be in their critical requirements. And it does allow you to, address these, close them ahead of that stage 2 audit taking place. So at this point, auditors actually get access to the ratings that the operation would have given themselves, because that's what stage 1 is about. You assess your own self, your own work, and you give yourself ratings. So auditors are actually given this, and then they also get an opportunity to actually add their own ratings, and that's what stage this stage is about. They add their own ratings. And in addition to adding their ratings, they will provide you with a rationale for why they would agree or disagree with the decision that you would have placed for yourself, or the rating that you would have given yourself. And then in the next slide, this is where we do stakeholder engagement planning. So planning, once again, is very important. It's crucial both for internal and our external stakeholders, as we do need inputs from both of them. So an important aspect of this step is actually being able to draft a strategy for your site that is that will obviously outline how this stakeholder engagement will actually take place. And although auditors do use the guidance that's provided by the site, at the end of the day, they also do their own internal review, and they could potentially augment the list that the site actually provides to them as potential stakeholders to engage. Of course, they'll use their own experience, their own expertise to come up with the last stakeholder inventory list. And at the end of it all, it's one thing to have a strategy and have the stakeholder list prepared, but finding out the best means or the best effective way of actually doing this outreach. So the auditors actually do that homework as well, and they will communicate. They use a range of either social media, radio, internet, whatever is required to make sure that the word is out there and that external stakeholders actually know that they have a voice in this process. In the next slide, I've actually just summarized the audit execution itself in just one slide to make it easy for you to sort of digest what I'm trying to explain, the process. So typically that stage 2 audit, which is the on-site one, it can take anything between 4 to 7 days to complete. That's around a week, right? And it does include around 4 to 7 auditors, all of them with different expertise. So they can bring a social expert, an environmental expert, governance expert, everyone that's actually required required to be able to do a thorough assessment of your site. And then, as I've explained in the previous slide, we do have a combination of external and internal engagements. So with the internal ones, they can interview your site personnel. There's more document review. There's detailed site observations. Even the workers, the employees themselves are interviewed. And then with our external activities on the right-hand side, you can see that the interviews can be held with community members, representatives, NGOs, public officials. And once again, these lists are discussed with the site ahead of time. So they do have that oversight to see what's actually going to happen on the ground. I think overall on here, I really just wanted to highlight how long these days are for the auditors. So they do work quite well to make sure that they do verify the performance. So it doesn't just end with a desktop review. They actually go to the ground and they ensure that they engage the right people so that they can get the right inputs into this against all the requirements of the IRMA standard. Now, on the next slide, I've put together tips for success for sites that do wish to take up this process from some of our experiences and what we've learned. Some of the tips that will help set you up for success is firstly, ensuring that you have the right site lead identified for your particular site if you do choose to pursue IRMA. It's very important because the site leads, they not only motivate, they facilitate, and they ensure that the team is always on track. And number two, the right team. You know, it's one thing to have a good leader, but you do need to have the right team that will support that lead. Also identifying the right chapter leads and champions. In my experience, it has been very, very important to have the right team, because as much as a leader might be able to motivate, encourage, facilitate, there's so much overlap and cross-cutting across the issues that these leads and champions themselves actually need to be able to work together, right? And just on the right-hand side, I think I was just highlighting for you to understand what expertise are actually needed throughout the IRMA standard. All of those, you can see that they're literally most of these issues are cross-cutting. Some of them relate. You can't do one without understanding the other. So there's a lot of interlinks going on between the different chapters that we have in the IRMA standard. And then in the next slide, I just put together some of the critical important resources that we do have that will help you through this process. Firstly, the most important one on the left, which is the standard itself. This is our main document. It does contain the metrics upon which you would, or your site or your operation would actually be measured against. And then I've included the guidance document in the middle. I've found in my own experience when I was training people at different sites throughout South America and South Africa, that this guidance document, and I believe will be applicable doesn't matter where you are in the world, that it has actually been extremely helpful. And Ellen, if you can just press again, just so that I can show colleagues on the line what's so important or what I found to be quite useful. And just again, press it again. So on the left-hand side, this is what you would find if you were just to open the standard, our standard as it is. It just outlines the requirement. But what you'd see on the right, which gives you the means of verification, it gives you more examples of evidence as well as explanatory notes, is what's actually captured in the guide itself. Hence, I love the guide. But also important to notice that most of this guide notes and evidence and everything is also built in the tool that Ellen will also take you through after this. Next slide. I think then, and in concluding my section, a key question that you are probably asking yourself right now is whether IRMA is really worth it for your particular company, for your site. And of course, the answer is yes. I think, firstly, we can all agree that this equal governance model does provide credibility. We are not just primarily overseen by industry, as Kristy has outlined. It is multi-stakeholder. It's a governance model that gives equal voting rights to all our interested parties. And I mean, IRMA is a high standard bar comprehensive standard. So when you do undergo IRMA, obviously you are benchmarking with the best, and you're also moving with responsible leaders, right? So yes, the process is quite rigorous, but it's very inclusive. It reduces that distrust, especially because external stakeholders are that involved and that they have that voice. And in closing, an important one to highlight for me as to why IRMA is the right tool for industry, for our industry, is that the report that's produced at the end, which is transparent, given to the public, is used or can be used as a tool for meaningful engagement to take place as operations do commit to transparency. And once again, I'll conclude by highlighting that at the end of the day, it will also help you to rebuild trust if it has been broken, or to just build trust and to have meaningful relationships with all your stakeholders. Over to you, Ellen.
Thank you, Aquinar. Hello, everyone. Again, I'm Alan Septoff. I'm IRMA's Information Systems Director, which means I'm the one who talks and makes sure that our tools work. So the self-assessment tool is how mines and their contractors measure themselves against the IRMA standard. At present, the standard for responsible mining issued in 2018 is in effect. And we also have out for comment the integrated standard for public comment, which is we're taking input until the end of January. I am going to be focusing on IRMA Ready, which is our draft standard that applies to exploration and development. And in the integrated standard, which we're taking comment on now, the extraction and exploration are combined into one standard. So self-assessment is an essential part of the audit process. As Aquinar discussed earlier, the desktop audit starts with the auditor's review of the self-assessment. So the self-assessment is actually a required process of independent audit whereby companies measure themselves and justify their measurement of themselves through the self-assessment tool, which the auditors can access after the self-assessment is over. A self-assessment can be confidential if a company wants it to be. It can also be public. They want it to be. You can't make claims about the results of a self-assessment. Only after an independent auditor measures a mine can claims be made. But if you are using the self-assessment tool, you can be listed on our website as a company going through the self-assessment process. And the tool can be used for as long as you want. Once you start using it, there's no time limit. It's available until you are done. For mining companies that are going to self-assessment, the first use of the tool is free, and subsequent uses are charged. So to get a self-assessment account for IRMA Ready, which is assessing against our pilot standard that covers exploration and development, the first step you need to do is email us and request one. Once you do that, we'll be back in touch and let you know when you can move to the next step and have your account. I'm going to do something a bit different. I put a bunch of detail into the slides that we shared with you, but in just a couple slides, I'm going to hop to a live demo of the tool to show you how it works. So once you log in, you come to this dashboard and click on the self-assessment that we have created for you in IRMA Ready. Okay. So once you log in, this is what you see. And now I'm going to jump over to the live demo. So bear with me just a second. Here we go. So this is the actual IRMA Ready tool that we are looking at right now. What you see here is every chapter in the IRMA Ready pilot standard. And so what the tool does is actually walk you through every requirement in every chapter of the standard, and it does it like this. Each chapter looks roughly the same. On the left is the panel through which you can navigate through each chapter in the standard. And in the right, each requirement is spelled out, and the notes on the requirement that Aquinar showed earlier when she covered the guidance document is spelled out as well. So the process of actually walking through the self-assessment allows you to learn about the standard. Because this is the IRMA Ready standard covering exploration and development, this is a pilot, and you can provide feedback on the standard that we will review as part of comments on the 2023 integrated standard. You can provide comments here, and we will take those into account. So at every stage, there is an opportunity to provide feedback about the standard and how you believe it should apply. So for each requirement, in order to assess yourself, you give yourself a score: fully meet, substantially meet, partially meets, does not meet, or not relevant. The explanations for those are fully written out in the slides that we are going to share with you. But in short, fully meets is self-explanatory. Substantially meets is the standard is in place, and there are just minor shortcomings in meeting the full intent of the standard. Partially meets is where the standard might be under development or in place, but is not being met, but there are processes in the way underway to implement them. So the rationale for rating is the explanation that you provide as to why you gave the score above. When you are using the tool, it's up to you how you decide how much information you decide to put in here. But if you are going to go to independent audit, meaning that you are going to be sharing this information with independent auditors in the future, it pays to put a bunch of effort into explaining the rationale. If you go to audit, that will have to be done at some point. And similarly, in order to support your rationale, one uploads evidence, either documents or links, and you can also provide details about the evidence that you are uploading. Again, the evidence and the rationale are how much you put in there is completely at your discretion. But if you are going to go to independent audit, this is essential information for the auditors to assign an achievement level. And actually, to that end, there is nothing preventing you from committing to independent audit before you start the self-assessment and working with the auditor as you're doing the self-assessment yourself. That is up to you. So underneath each requirement, we ask for feedback, because this is the IRMA Ready standard, applies to, again, exploration and development, and we are looking for your thoughts. That is essentially it in terms of entering information. You note at the bottom of the screen, after you assign a score and exit the chapter, it will give you a score for that chapter. The ticker at the bottom lets you know how many you have, how many requirements or questions you have answered, but it doesn't provide a score until you exit the chapter and move on to the next one. It's also important to remember that wherever you see a save button, you need to save. There's no autosave associated with the Mind Measure tool. So let's see on time. Okay. So one last thing, if you go out to the self-assessment summary page, under options, you can download the responses and download a list of the evidence that you have provided through the tool, and that is downloaded as spreadsheets for sharing. So that is the IRMA Ready pilot test self-assessment tool. The assessment tool for the full mining standard, the official standard that's in place now, that was released in 2018, that's a bit more of a robust tool with a bit more features, but this is the one that applies to exploration now. So give me just a second. Okay, so that about wraps it up. Let me flip back to the slides. And share my screen again. So as I said earlier, IRMA is evolving to integrate the exploration and development standard and combining it with the mining standard and mineral processing into the standard that is out for comment right now through the end of January, excuse me. And in order to provide comment, which we very much hope that you will do, you should just visit our website. If you go to the front page of the site, it will direct you to the number of ways. There's an online form, or you can email us, or you can upload PDFs. And as noted, comments can be treated confidentially. Just let us know if that's the way that you would prefer to have your comments registered. But we very much encourage you to comment. And with that, I think we should move to question and answers. Thank you for the opportunity.
Opening my microphone. Alan, thank you so much. In fact, thank you to all of you, to Aquinar and to Kristy, for the presentations. I noticed that we have already questions in the Q&A. And the first one was about the coverage of the standards, and the second related to this one is how does the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance compare to other standards? And if I may, because I was also taking notice, I noticed that the audit procedure is not so different from the ISO, for instance, 14,000, but I guess there are some differences that might be relevant to highlight. So the question, how does IRMA really compares to the other existing or applicable standards in the mining sector?
I love this question, and it's one that we frequently hear, so thank you for asking. So generally, we see the way that the IRMA standard and system is really unique among standards for the mining sector is in our governance model, because we do have equal representation across those 6 houses of mining companies, purchasing companies, investors, alongside affected communities, NGOs, and organized labor. And that really gives us a different level of accountability and trust than we see in other mining standard systems. It's extremely important, especially to affected communities and NGOs and organized labor, that a system is run in this way, that it's not only a industry association that is holding power and control over a standard and assessing itself against it, but that we have this holistic framework that is governed by a multi-stakeholder standard. So the next level of inquiry is really looking at the standard itself, the level of detail, the level of rigor in the standard. And most assessors will only look there, what is covered in the standard, and not also look at the governance of the standard and how our assessments conducted. But looking at our standard, it is more robust and comprehensive than other mining sector standards, with a few exceptions that we're now addressing as we update the standard for responsible mining. Some of those areas where there was room for improvement included more comprehensive coverage of greenhouse gas emissions and reporting, extending into scope 3 emissions. We have also amplified how we're talking about gender equality and gender protections. Gender was a theme throughout the 2018 standard for responsible mining, but we've updated important language, including the term maternal leave, for example, now that you'll see that's called parental leave, recognizing that both parents are able to take leave from work to participate in childcare. It's not just the mother, and there are very strong feelings about that. But that's just one anecdotal point. We've also looked at ways that we can evolve to address realities and need to move towards circular economies, and that mining companies increasingly see this as a strategy, a tool for good practice and for economic benefit. You know, why waste any material if it can be saved, reused, if we can make materials more durable, if we can avoid having to replace parts of machinery. So there's a wide range of strategies, and we've incorporated that into the standard, which is quite novel, to really make sure that entities are creating a plan as part of their environmental and social impact assessment, and they report against that. We may start having more detailed requirements, but generally we're asking sites to come up with a plan for circularity and report against that. There are many more examples I could provide. And Aquinar has taken us through the audit process. And that is another area where IRMA is very unique, and the level of engagement with affected communities, local rights holders, workers at the mine site level who are interviewed as part of the on-site assessment. And that, again, is really important to have a holistic view of the impacts and benefits of the mining sector. And underlying all of this is that transparency. The reports from an IRMA audit are made freely available to the public, and it drives a deeper level of engagement and demonstrating when we have, you know, every 3 years is a new IRMA audit, but between the audits is a surveillance audit that's about 1.5 years. And after the initial audit, to see, has improvement been made, where there's still gaps, where have gaps been addressed, and showing that continuous improvement. So those are some of the ways in which our standard and system are unique, and that has really supported building the level of trust. Aquinar said it beautifully, that really, whether a site is restoring trust or building that trust initially, it really takes a deep level of engagement and partnership. And that's what we are aiming to establish through the IRMA standard. It has, you know, requirements for engagement throughout the mine site process, not just initially, but as a continuous part of any operation, and its accountability to stakeholders and rights holders.
Thank you, Kristy. There's another question here, which is about, I believe it might be to Alan, because you mentioned that the self-assessment tool is free. And the question is, are the results confidential, or are there the risk, that's my heading, are there any risks of this being spilled out and the company in the end me in the spotlight?
Mm-hmm. The self-assessment results are confidential. And in fact, they're, according to our data privacy policy, they're the evidence and that you upload is confidential even within IRMA. Once, obviously, you go to independent audit, then the results are public. But as far as the self-assessment goes, the results are confidential, and if you desire, the fact that you're using the tool is confidential.
Thank you, Alan. Another question that was raised is about the auditors. So about the audit process and the experts that you engage, these auditors. The question was, apparently there is space for cooperation between, let's say, the owner of the site and the auditor. And the question is, who are the auditors? Because this is so comprehensive, and how are they selected? Because I assume they will need a quite large expertise in many different topics, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely, Vitor. I can respond to that. It's a good
Please,
question.
Aquinar.
So at this point, we've got two auditing firms that are actually approved to be able to do the auditing work for IRMA. It's ERM CVS and SCS. We are also in the process of actually revising the assurance process. With that, there'll also be an exercise where we actually look at expanding that group so that it's not just the two and that it's more. Now, to answer that important question that was asked, how are these people now selected? So, for example, if you, as a site, choose to engage with ERM, let's say, as your auditor, now the ERM team will actually provide IRMA with their proposed list of the auditors, let's say between 4 or 7. Like I said, everything will be dependent on how many requirements actually apply to your site, because remember, not every requirement actually applies to your site, right? It will also be linked to the expertise that are actually required to come and do that audit. And that's the team that will be put forward. Let's say, for argument's sake, 6 of them are put forward. Now, those are not automatically accepted as the auditors that will actually go and do the audit. IRMA itself has its own criteria that it actually looks at. There are so many things that they look at. They look at your conflict of interest, qualification, very important, and expertise and all of that to actually execute that session. Then you might find that that list of 6 might actually be augmented by IRMA, depending obviously on that list of the criteria that they look at. Now, answering that question, I see also in the webinar chat, there's an important question that's asked about auditors as well, where they're saying a previous speaker mentioned that sites complete the self-assessment in conjunction with the auditor. I'm not sure, maybe this person misunderstood what Ellen was presenting. Essentially, the site itself first does that self-assessment without the auditor helping them to fill it in. Once they are done and they hand it over to these auditors, in this case, like I said, if it's ERM, for example, then ERM, without the site there, they will go and do their own desktop review. And in addition to this, the rating that the site would have given themselves, now the auditors will now add their own rating. But not only will they do that, to ensure that the site will obviously understand what's missing or where they may be off track or on track, they'll also provide a rationale. So they're not doing it together. I just wanted to clarify that confusion. Because I see they're talking about strict requirements prohibiting such firms. So just to provide clarity, auditors and sites are not doing it together. The mine does the self-assessment and then they'll hand it over. There isn't a period to say the self-assessment needs to be done at this point or at this point. The site itself will decide. When they feel that they're ready, they'll hand it over to the appointed auditor. And that team will be the ones that actually conduct that review. Of course, at the end of that review, then the site has a chance to go and review it and decide if they want to do a corrective action plan. If they're comfortable, they can go proceed and actually do the stage 2 audit itself. So yeah, I hope that has provided some clarity on that question.
Thank you, Aquinar. And in response to Vitor's comment about ISO, we do integrate and align with ISO standards, including in how we conduct the audit process, but we also consider these in the IRMA standard as well. But I'd like to give Pamela Lesser just a moment to share with you a bit of how we're working with EU policymakers, and then turn to any additional questions that you may have. Pamela.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kristy. Thank you, Vitor. Yes, my focus is, I think, much more specific than all of my colleagues. And I do focus on EU policy and raising awareness about IRMA and EU policy. And we do work with the European Commission quite closely to inform particularly the Critical Raw Materials Act. And I think one of the things that we're proudest of, to be honest, is that the Critical Raw Materials Act does include the need for certification schemes for what they call strategic projects. And those certification schemes have certain criteria. And so it appears that one of the criteria will be a multi-stakeholder governance scheme. And this is what all of my colleagues have been talking about, that it differentiates IRMA from the other industry schemes. IRMA is not an industry scheme, and I think that's very important. And also the points, especially Aquinar was talking about in terms of the on-site audits, that they have to be third-party independent on-site audits. So there's some core elements of IRMA that we feel are very, very important and would make better legislation. And fortunately, EU policymakers seem to be listening to that. So very grateful. So that's just one of the ways, for example, that we're working on the EU level.
Thank you, Pamela. Can I pick on that just to ask you if there are any risk of bias? Because if you are already looking to projects that were, let's say, selected as strategic by the European Commission, is there a bias in that process? Because despite being strategic, they might not be performing as well as others that are not considered strategic.
I mean, honestly, that is not something that we are working with, because you're right, who defines strategic? And it's going to be left, I think, to the member states ultimately to define that. So it will differ across 27 different EU countries.
But regardless of the type of material, whether it's designated as being a critical mineral, a strategic mineral, a mineral of strategic importance, IRMA audits can be used at a mine site by private entities, by public state-owned enterprises, to create more transparency and to really help a site be successful economically, socially. That is why sites engage in the IRMA system. It is good for business, and it's meeting the expectations of regulators, of purchasing companies, of investors, and certainly of civil society.
Of course. Okay, I don't see more questions, at least not unanswered questions. Yes?
Vitor, was question 1 answered? Because I think that's a crucial one if it wasn't answered. Does IRMA only apply to mining sites itself? Will the 2023 standard include exploration sites? Because that's a key one. If we leave without answering that one.
Aquinar, please go ahead and answer it, because it was posted as answered already, but I missed that. Please go ahead.
Okay, no, perfect. Thank you so much for this question. You would have seen that from the last 2 slides, just to jog your memory, we do have a draft standard. Now, this draft standard that we've released for comments now, all the way to the end of January next year, is actually integrated. So we no longer have an individual standard just for exploration, one just for processing, and one just for mining. So now we have all 3 of these standards integrated. So we have the exploration one, which is called IRMA Ready. We've got the normal mining standard, as well as the processing standard in one. Now, for those that are in exploration, because I do understand the stages, obviously, from my experience as an exploration geologist, there are different stages, as you'd understand. So the standard does outline in a Excel spreadsheet that if you are at this stage of exploration, this is what applies to you. So you'll find that everything is actually in one document. It's so important that you do get a moment to just provide a comment, or even to just look at the standard and actually reflect on it. So we will be having subsequent sessions where we either dwell into different topics. Next year, early next year, we'll also be having sector sessions where we'll try to collect as much detail from those who wouldn't have had an opportunity to go and actually sit with the standard. But our plea is really that you go and look at it. It's so important, because before we finalize it, it gives you a chance to actually have a voice, because this is what you would at the end of the day be assessed on. And like I said, it's now one standard, it's no longer 3 standards. So that was very important. So yes, to answer your question, will the 2023 standard include exploration site? Absolutely, including exploration, including mining, including processing in one document. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Aquinar. And thank you also to you, Alan, because you just put on the screen, I believe, something that is very relevant to close this session. So the consultation period is still open, as you showing us, until the end of January. And you have there the online platform for comments. So please go to the IRMA website and participate. Basically, I guess this is the message. So thank you to Pamela, Kristy, Aquinar, and Alan for participating in this EFG webinar. I also want to thank to the audience for joining us today. It was great to have this group of people. I'm assuming that you are following the EFG webinars. The next one is scheduled to happen on the 5th of December, and it will be about the new roles in the energy expansion. So thank you again for joining. Thank you to our speakers, and I look forward to the next opportunity. Thank you, and have a nice afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vitor.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.